The morning sun peeked through the diner's windows as steam rose from fresh coffee pots. Mai balanced 3 loaded plates along her arm, a skill she'd mastered over 3 years of waiting tables. Her regular customers were already filing in, bringing with them the familiar morning chatter that she'd grown to love. As she glided between tables, a melody danced in her head. It was something she'd been working on during late nights, after her shifts ended. The tune had started as a simple pattern of kitchen sounds. The rhythm of spatulas on the grill, the gentle clink of coffee cups, and the swoosh of the swinging kitchen door. Now it was becoming something more. "Order up," called out Uncle Joe, the cook who'd taken her under his wing since her first day. His voice boomed through the diner, mixing with the sizzle of bacon and the whir of the milkshake machine. Mai hummed her tune a bit louder as she rushed to grab the fresh plates. "Someone's in a good mood today," smiled Mrs. P., a retired teacher who always occupied the corner booth on Tuesday mornings. She'd been coming to the diner longer than Mai had been alive, and she never missed a detail. "That's a pretty tune you're humming, dear." Mai felt her cheeks warm as she poured Mrs. P. her second cup of coffee. She hadn't realized her humming had gotten loud enough for others to hear. "Just a little something stuck in my head," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The morning rush was in full swing now. Business people hurried in for quick breakfasts, construction workers filled the counter seats, and young parents tried to keep their children from redecorating the tables with syrup. Through it all, May moved like she was dancing, her feet finding the spaces between chairs and customers as if following sheet music only she could see. During a brief moment of calm, she stood behind the counter, absent-mindedly tapping her fingers against the surface. The pattern matched perfectly with a piece she'd been practicing on her old keyboard at home. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the rhythm of a waltz she'd been trying to perfect. "Hey, dreamer." Uncle Joe's voice snapped her back to reality. He wasn't angry. He never was, but his eyes twinkled with knowing. Table 7's getting hungry. Mee grabbed her notepad and hurried over to the table, but her mind was already split between two worlds. Here she was, in her black uniform and comfortable shoes, taking orders for scrambled eggs and pancakes. But in her heart, she was sitting at a piano, her fingers flying over ivory keys, creating something beautiful. The regulars had noticed how she'd started using different serving trays for different tables. The metal ones for quick breakfasts because they made a sharp staccato sound when she set them down, and the plastic ones for family meals because they had a softer, more gentle tone. They didn't know she was composing music in her head, turning their ordinary breakfast into a symphony. Between refilling coffee cups and clearing tables, Mee kept stealing glances at the clock. In just a few hours, she'd be done with her shift. Then she could rush next door to the music shop, where an old piano waited for her. The owner let her practice there during quiet afternoons, and those precious moments made all the morning rushes worth it. For now, though, she had orders to take and coffee to pour. But even as she wrote down "sunny side up" and "wheat toast, no butter," the melody in her head kept growing, building into something that was uniquely hers. Because while some people saw just another waitress in a small-town diner, they didn't know that every step, every movement, every sound was being woven into a song that was waiting to be played. The little bell above the music shop's door chimed softly as Mai slipped inside, still wearing her diner uniform. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting warm light on rows of guitars and sheet music. She breathed in deeply, taking in the familiar scent of wood polish and old paper that always made her feel at home. "Ah, right on time," called out Mr. Wu, the elderly shop owner, from behind a stack of music books. His eyes crinkled with warmth as he spotted her. Over the past few months, he'd become used to her daily visits during her breaks, watching as she longingly eyed the upright piano in the corner. The piano wasn't anything special. Its mahogany finish was worn in places, and a few keys had slight yellowing. But to May, it was more precious than gold. She remembered the day Mr. Wu had first caught her staring at it. Instead of shooing her away, he'd simply asked, "Do you play?" Those 3 words had changed everything. Today, like every day, she made her way to the piano, carefully setting down her name tag and order pad on a nearby shelf. Her fingers were still slightly warm from carrying coffee pots, but they moved with surprising grace as she lifted the key cover. The first notes were always tentative, like testing water before diving in. But soon, the music shop filled with melody, not the classical pieces her childhood teacher had insisted upon, but something entirely new. The morning's rhythms from the diner transformed into flowing notes. The clatter of plates became delicate arpeggios, the hum of conversation turned into warm chord progressions. Mr. Wu pretended to organize sheet music nearby, but she knew he was listening. He always did. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and smile, swaying slightly as she played. Other times, he'd quietly hum along, even though he'd never heard the pieces before. They were all her own compositions, born from the everyday symphony of her life. "You know," he said during a pause between songs, "my granddaughter used to play. She had good technique, but she never had what you have." He tapped his chest, right over his heart. "The music, it needs to come from here first." Mi's fingers found another melody, this one inspired by the way sunlight danced across the diner's counter during slow afternoons. "I just wish I had more time to practice," she admitted, her hands never stopping. "Between morning shifts and helping at home." Mr. Wu nodded knowingly. He'd heard pieces of her story over the months. How she'd learned piano as a child. How life had pushed music aside. How she still couldn't quite let go of the dream. "Sometimes," he said, adjusting his glasses, "the longest journeys happen in small steps." The shop's clock chimed, reminding Mai that her break was nearly over. But before she could close the piano, Mr. Wu held up a finger. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the back room. He returned with a ring of keys, selecting one and holding it out to her. "For the shop," he explained, seeing her confused expression. "Some of us are night owls, not early birds. If you want to practice after your evening shifts." He let the offer hang in the air. Mai stared at the key, hardly daring to breathe. "But your instruments, the security." Mr. Wu waved away her concerns. "Music isn't meant to be locked away. Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "the street's been livelier since you started playing. Even my grumpy neighbor has stopped complaining about the noise." As Mai hurried back to the diner, the key safely tucked in her pocket, her steps felt lighter than air. That evening, long after the last customer had gone home, a gentle melody drifted out of the darkened music shop. Anyone passing by might have wondered about the mysterious pianist, never guessing it was the same person who'd served them coffee that morning. In the quiet of night, surrounded by silent instruments and sheets of music, Mi's hidden talent bloomed like a flower reaching for the sun. Each note she played was a step closer to the person she wanted to become, each melody a thread weaving together her 2 worlds, the one that paid the bills, and the one that fed her soul. The Tuesday morning rush had just ended when the bell above the diner door chimed. In walked the quiet man who always ordered the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, and a small bowl of fruit. He'd been coming in for weeks now, always sitting at the corner table with a stack of papers to grade. May knew his routine by heart. He'd spend exactly 2 hours there, marking papers with a red pen while absently humming classical pieces under his breath. She'd caught fragments of Bach, Chopin, and once, a piece she'd been struggling with for months, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Today, though, something was different. As she refilled his coffee cup, she couldn't help but hum the melody she'd been working on last night at Mr. Wu's shop. It was still rough around the edges, but the core of it felt right. A gentle tune that rose and fell like waves. The man's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his eyes sharp with interest. "That's an unusual piece," he said, setting down his red pen. "I don't recognize it." Mai felt her cheeks warm. Oh, it's nothing, she said, trying to brush it off. Just something stuck in my head. No, he said, shaking his head. The harmonics are quite complex. The way it shifts from major to minor in the bridge. He paused, studying her face. You composed it, didn't you? The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. How did you? I'm Professor Chen, he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. I teach music theory at the conservatory. And that piece you were humming, it's not from any standard repertoire I know. Mai found herself pulling up a chair, the nearly empty diner forgotten for a moment. The professor listened intently as words tumbled out of her. About the piano in Mr. Wu's shop, about the melodies that lived in her head, about the years of lessons she'd taken until life had gotten in the way. Play something for me, he said suddenly. It wasn't a request so much as a gentle command. I can't. My shift doesn't end for hours, and the music shop. Tomorrow then, he said, pulling out a business card. The conservatory has practice rooms. Come by at noon. Seeing her hesitation, he added, just one piece. That's all I'm asking. That night, May could hardly sleep. Her fingers moved restlessly across her bedspread, practicing invisible keys. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her heart raced with nervous energy. When noon came, she found herself standing outside the imposing brick building of the conservatory. Her diner uniform was carefully folded in her bag, replaced by the nicest clothes she owned. They still felt inadequate among the well-dressed students hurrying past with instrument cases. Professor Chen met her at the door, leading her through maze-like hallways to a small room with a beautiful grand piano. The instrument gleamed in the sunlight streaming through tall windows, its polished surface reflecting her nervous face. Play what you were humming yesterday, he said simply, settling into a chair. Mi's hands shook as she sat at the piano. This was different from the worn upright in Mr. Wu's shop. Each key felt like silk under her fingers, responding to the lightest touch. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody started softly, like early morning light creeping into the diner. Then it grew, building with the rhythms of her daily life. The clash of plates, the murmur of voices, the hiss of the coffee machine. But there was something else too, something that spoke of dreams too big for a small-town diner, of music that refused to stay hidden. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Mai opened her eyes to find Professor Chen leaning forward in his chair, his expression intense. How long have you been composing? He asked quietly. I don't really compose, she stammered. I just play what I hear in my head. That's exactly what composing is, he said, standing up. Tell me, have you ever considered studying music seriously? Because what I just heard, he paused, choosing his words carefully. What I just heard was someone who deserves to be heard. The sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to sparkle with possibility. Mai lifted her hands, still resting on the keys, and felt something shift inside her. Like a door she'd thought locked forever was slowly creeping open. Dawn hadn't quite broken when Mi's alarm buzzed. Her fingers were still stiff from last night's practice, but there was no time to rest. The early morning diner shift waited for no one, and she had promised Professor Chen she would master the new piece before their next lesson. The kitchen light flickered as she warmed up leftover soup for breakfast. Sheet music covered half the table, coffee stains marking the corners of pages she'd studied late into the night. Her mother's note on the fridge caught her eye. Don't forget to pay the electric bill. Reality had a way of creeping in, even among the dreams of music. At the diner, Uncle Joe noticed her yawning while picking up orders. Late night again, he asked, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. When she nodded, he slid an extra cup of coffee her way. You know, my daughter used to dance ballet. Worked 2 jobs to pay for lessons. Sometimes the hardest dreams are the ones worth chasing. The morning rush kept her moving, but her mind drifted between orders. She'd started hearing music in everything now. The way the sugar shaker tapped against the counter made a perfect eighth note. The swing of the kitchen door created a steady rhythm. Even her footsteps between tables had become a metronome, heaping time for the melodies in her head. "Order up." Uncle Joe's voice snapped her back to reality. She grabbed the plates, but her tired hands betrayed her. The crash of falling dishes echoed through the diner, sending scrambled eggs sliding across the floor. The room fell silent. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, kneeling to clean up the mess. Her hands were shaking. When was the last time she dropped an order? First year, maybe? The diner's owner, Mrs. Lin, appeared with a broom. Instead of the scolding Maya expected, she simply asked, "When did you last take a real break?" Her eyes were kind but concerned. "You've been working splits for weeks now." That afternoon, instead of rushing to practice, Mai found herself in Mrs. Lin's tiny office. The walls were covered with old photos of the diner through the years. Professor Chen called. Mrs. Lin said, straightening a picture, "He told me about your talent." Mi's heart stopped. This was it. She'd have to choose. The diner or the music. Reality or dreams. But Mrs. Lin surprised her. "My mother always said a bird needs two wings to fly," she said, pulling out the schedule book. "Let's figure this out properly." Together, they rebuilt Mi's schedule. Morning shifts would end earlier, giving her time to practice before lessons. Some regulars even offered to adjust their usual times, swearing the coffee tasted better when accompanied by her humming anyway. That evening, Mai brought a pot of her mother's soup to Professor Chen's studio. "Payment for today's lesson," she explained. He raised an eyebrow, but accepted it with a smile. They'd worked out their own arrangement. She'd cook meals for his family twice a week in exchange for lessons. "Your technique is improving," he noted as she played through scales. "But you look exhausted. Remember, music needs energy to truly live." She thought about protesting, but her shoulders ached from carrying trays, and the keys blurred slightly before her eyes. "I just need to work harder," she insisted. "No," he corrected gently. "You need to work smarter. Music isn't about pushing until you break. It's about finding balance, like in your compositions. Sometimes the most important part is knowing when to rest." On her way home, Mai stopped by the diner to pick up her forgotten apron. Through the window, she saw the evening shift in full swing, the dance she'd performed countless times. But now there was a new dance too, one that moved between coffee pots and piano keys, between duty and dreams. She touched the window lightly, leaving a small fingerprint on the glass. The diner's lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played. For the first time in weeks, she simply stood and listened, letting the moment wash over her. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another shift, another lesson. But for now, she was learning the most important piece of all, the art of living in both worlds. The hand-drawn poster hung slightly crooked on the diner's front window. Special Friday night fundraiser. Help our local children's hospital. Mi's heart skipped every time she walked past it, knowing what was coming. Her name was there at the bottom, in Mrs. Lin's careful handwriting. Special musical performance by our very own Mi. She hadn't planned on performing. The fundraiser was supposed to be a simple dinner service with the proceeds going to charity. But word had gotten out about her music, probably Uncle Joe, who'd overheard her practicing one evening after closing. Before she knew it, the whole staff had conspired to make it happen. "We're moving the counter displays," Mrs. Lin announced 3 days before the event, pointing to the corner. "The piano will fit perfectly there." May nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. "Piano. But we don't have." "Mr. Wu is lending us his upright for the evening," Uncle Joe called from the kitchen, grinning. "Already arranged everything." The days leading up to Friday felt like a dream. Regular customers kept giving her encouraging smiles, and she overheard snippets of conversation about the waitress who plays like an angel. Her hands shook so much while serving that she had to switch to the plastic cups instead of ceramic. Professor Chen stopped by during his usual time, carrying a folder of sheet music. For the performance, he said, sliding it across the table. But May shook her head. I want to play my own pieces, she said quietly. The ones about this place, about everyone here. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were determined. The professor smiled, pushing his glasses up. I was hoping you'd say that. Friday evening arrived with a soft spring rain. The diner had been transformed, tables rearranged, tiny battery-operated candles flickering in mason jars, and Mr. Wu's piano nestled in the corner like it had always belonged there. Mai peeked through the kitchen door. The diner was packed. She recognized faces she'd served for years. The morning rush regulars, the weekend families, even the quiet bookkeeper who always sat by the window. They were all here, these people who'd unknowingly become part of her music. Her diner uniform felt strange without the usual apron. Mrs. Lin had insisted she wear something special, a simple blue dress that her mother had altered the night before, staying up late with worried hands and proud eyes. 5 minutes, Uncle Joe whispered, squeezing her shoulder as he passed with a tray of appetizers. The familiar scent of coffee and grilled onions filled the air, mixing with the excitement that hummed through the crowd. Mi's fingers found the keys, testing them silently. The piano wasn't as grand as the one at the conservatory, but it felt right somehow. This was where her music had been born, between coffee refills and breakfast specials. Mrs. Lin's voice cut through the chatter. Tonight, we have something special for you all. The room quieted. Many of you have heard her humming while she serves your coffee. Now we get to hear the full song. Walking to the piano felt like floating. The faces before her blurred slightly, but she caught glimpses. Mr. Wu beaming from his seat near the door, Professor Chen nodding encouragingly, her mother wiping tears before they could fall. Her fingers touched the keys, and suddenly she was 5 years old again, discovering music for the first time. The first notes rose softly, like early morning mist. It was the piece she'd composed during countless dawn shifts, watching the sun paint the diner in gold. The music grew, weaving together all the sounds of her daily life. The gentle clink of spoons stirring coffee, the laughter of children in the breakfast rush, the quiet conversations of elderly couples sharing Sunday pie. Each note told a story, and these people, her unexpected family, heard themselves in every measure. When the last note faded, the silence lasted just a heartbeat. Then the diner erupted. Applause thundered against the windows, and someone in the back whistled. Through tear-blurred eyes, Mai saw Uncle Joe pretending to wipe his face with his apron, and Mrs. Lin clutching her hands to her heart. But it was the faces of the customers that moved her most. They were looking at her like they were seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. Not just the waitress who refilled their coffee, but the musician who had been there all along, turning their everyday moments into something magical. The morning after the fundraiser performance, everything felt different. Sunlight streamed through the diner windows as usual, but now customers greeted Mai with a new kind of smile. Phone videos of her performance had spread through the small town like wildfire, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about music instead of menu specials. My niece is getting married next month, said a regular customer, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Would you consider playing at a ceremony? Before Mai could respond, another customer chimed in about a birthday party, and someone else mentioned a local arts festival. The opportunities were like spring flowers blooming all at once. Beautiful, overwhelming, and a little frightening. Professor Chen had also brought news. A small music academy across town was looking for a piano teacher. Just beginners, he explained, but it's a start. That evening, Mai sat at her tiny kitchen table, surrounded by papers. Her work schedule, performance requests, and teaching opportunities spread out before her like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. The diner had been her safe harbor for so long. Could she really cut back her hours? Her mother found her there, still staring at the papers. Without a word, she put on a pot of tea and sat down. "You know," she said, pouring 2 cups, "when I first came to this country, I was scared too. Sometimes the biggest steps in life feel like jumping off a cliff. But what if I fail?" May whispered, voicing the fear that had been living in her chest. "The diner is stable. Safe." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "And it will still be there. But you've outgrown your safe harbor, little fish. It's time to swim in bigger waters." The next morning, May arrived at the diner early to talk to Mrs. Lin. Her hands trembled as she explained her need to reduce hours, but Mrs. Lin was already nodding before she finished speaking. "Honestly," Mrs. Lin said with a gentle smile, "I'm surprised you didn't ask sooner. After that performance, this place was never going to be big enough to hold all your music." They worked out a new schedule together, 3 shifts a week instead of 6. It would mean tighter budgeting, careful planning, and some sleepless nights. But as they wrote it down, Mai felt something settle in her chest, like a bird finding a new perch. Uncle Joe stuck his head out of the kitchen when he heard the news. "About time," he called out, waving a spatula. "But you better still make time to play for us old-timers once in a while." The regulars took the news with a mix of pride and wistfulness. Mrs. P., the retired teacher who'd been coming in for decades, pulled Maya aside during her last full-time shift. "You know, dear," she said, pressing something into Mi's hand, "when you're ready to record your first album, I want to be first in line." It was a card with a small check inside. Not enough to change her life, but enough to bring tears to her eyes. Throughout the day, other customers slipped her notes, small gifts, and words of encouragement. Mr. Wu appeared at lunchtime with a folder full of sheet music. "For your new students," he said with a wink. That afternoon, May played her last shift just like her first, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and humming along to the rhythm of the diner. But now her songs had names, her dreams had shape, and her future had a different kind of music calling. As she hung up her full-time apron for the last time, she ran her fingers over the small coffee stains and tiny burns, battle scars from years of honest work. Each mark told a story, each wrinkle held a memory. This wasn't really goodbye, she realized. It was more like turning the page to a new chapter, one where the diner would always be part of her song, just not the whole melody anymore. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of promise. Through the window, she could see new faces at her old tables, other servers learning the dance she knew by heart. Life would go on here, with or without her constant presence. But she had given this place her music, and in return, it had given her wings. The recording studio was nothing like Mai had imagined. No flashy equipment or sophisticated soundboards, just a converted attic space above Mr. Wu's music shop, filled with borrowed equipment and determination. But when she sat at the piano, none of that mattered. The music was all that existed. "Take 5, called the young sound engineer, adjusting his headphones. "That last run was perfect for morning rush hour. You really captured the feeling of sunrise." Mai stretched her fingers, smiling at the title. Her first album was taking shape, a collection of pieces born from her years at the diner. Each song told a story: the quiet moments before opening, the busy lunch rushes, the lazy Sunday afternoons when regulars lingered over pie and coffee. The album cover photo had been Uncle Joe's idea. They'd taken it early one morning in the diner. May sitting at Mr. Wu's piano in her old uniform, the sunrise painting everything in gold. "That's who you are," Uncle Joe had said. Both worlds, together in one picture. Between recording sessions, she still worked her 3 shifts at the diner. The regulars loved hearing the progress updates on her album, and new customers often did double takes when they realized their server was the same person whose music played softly through the diner's speakers. Her piano students at the Music Academy brought a different kind of joy. Many were children who reminded her of herself, eyes lighting up at the first successful scale, fingers stumbling but determined. One little girl had even started composing her own melodies, inspired by the sounds of her family's restaurant. "You're going to need these," Mrs. Lynn said one morning, sliding a stack of papers across the counter. They were pre-orders for the album. Dozens of them, filled out by loyal customers who'd watched her journey from the beginning. The bottom one was from Mrs. P, who'd kept her promise about being first in line. The day the albums arrived was like a holiday at the diner. Boxes stacked in the back room, the cover photo catching light, Diner Symphony in simple letters across the top. Me traced the words with her finger, hardly believing they were real. That evening, they held a small release party right there in the diner. Tables pushed back, Mr. Wu's piano in its familiar corner, and every seat filled with someone who'd been part of the journey. Professor Chen sat with her mother, both beaming with pride. Uncle Joe had outdone himself with a cake decorated with tiny musical notes made of frosting. As Mai played selections from the album, she watched the faces around her. There was the businessman who'd always requested extra napkins, now swaying slightly to her music. The young couple who'd gotten engaged in booth 3, holding hands just like they had that day. The evening shift waitress who'd covered for her countless times so she could practice. Between songs, stories flowed as freely as coffee. "Remember when she used to hum while taking orders?" Someone called out. "Now look at her." Another voice added, "I knew she had something special when she turned my dropped spoon into a percussion solo." Later that night, after the party had ended and the last dishes were cleared, Mai sat alone at the piano. The diner felt different in the quiet, like a theater after the show, still holding echoes of applause. She played softly, a new melody emerging from the day's emotions. A movement caught her eye. The night cleaning crew had arrived. Without missing a beat, she motioned them to come in. "Would you like to hear something new?" she asked. They gathered around the piano, still holding their mops and brooms as she played the piece taking shape in her heart. This was her real success, she realized. Not the album, not the teaching job, not even the upcoming local concerts. It was this, the ability to share music with anyone who wanted to listen, to turn everyday moments into melodies, to find beauty in both the grand performances and the quiet midnight songs. The diner had given her more than a job. It had given her a story worth telling through music. And as she played for this small, unexpected audience, she knew that every note of her journey, from serving plates to playing keys, had been exactly right.